I guess, well, that's another story there.
Yes.
But why are we here? Her second book was Star Trek, the first movie bringing the franchise to the big screen, 1969 to 1980. It was published in October of 2019, and it's available through a lot of places. I will say that I and one of our listeners, Amber, watched the movie a week and a half ago, and I'm looking forward to this conversation because I don't remember it being as good as as it was. It was a lot better than I remembered it being. So, and she also followed up the book with presenting Persis I can never say this. Help me with this, Sherilyn.
Presenting Persis Khambatta.
So, and I'm sure we'll be talking about her also in this conversation. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to let you take it away, and we'll go from there. And then when you're done, we'll have some questions and answers.
All right, sounds good. So once again, thank you again for having me. It is a great honor to be here talking about the first Star Trek movie, about Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which a film I've always loved, and a film which I am deeply conscious. I've studied it so much, like over the past decade, and I've learned a lot of interesting things. And one thing I'll say about this book, and also presenting Persis Khambatta, is these are based on primary sources. These books are about what actually happened based on, like I say, primary sources, what people wrote at the time, the news, the actual things that happened. These books do not repeat the rumors that Star Trek fandom loves so much. I'm trying to go for the truth here. So speaking of truth, let me get my slideshow started. From current slide. Nope, that's not right. Just 1 second here. Okay. Now. I know this is almost as exciting as watching Star Trek: The Motion Picture, isn't it? I've reached like that level of entertainment. Okay, all right, here we go. So I'm going to read from the section of the book titled Prologue, Star Trek: The MacArthur Premiere. Robert Wise was making short work of the hors d'oeuvres. He had always been a nervous eater, and he was more nervous now than before any previous premiere in his storied career. It was Thursday, December 6th, 1979, just a few hours until the black tie, $100 per person world premiere of Star Trek: The Motion Picture at the MacArthur Theater in Washington, D.C. This screening for Wise's film had been announced in August 1979, and Paramount was holding a cocktail party at the swanky, recently opened Four Seasons Hotel in Georgetown, where most everyone involved with the film was staying on the studio's dime. For as much money as the Mountain, which is what Paramount was often called, for as much money as the Mountain had spent on the film, the charges for the rooms and/or their ransacked minibars would be negligible. Wise was legendary for keeping his cool under duress, and watching him stress gorge on victuals was making Susan Sackett lose her own appetite. A former school teacher who had been hired as Star Trek producer Gene Roddenberry's secretary in August 1974, Sackett had been involved since the beginning, or earlier, depending on what point in time you declared to be the beginning. In addition to seeing a rough cut of the live-action footage sans music or effects in October 1979, she'd watched the answer print a few days before the MacArthur premiere. Like so many other things about the film, the answer print was late, originally due to be completed in mid-November. Beyond the mysterious cabal at the MPAA who had rated the film G the day before yesterday, only about a half dozen other people had seen the movie so far. Like to enter into the record, Star Trek: The Motion Picture is rated G. That is what the official rating was. Paramount was very embarrassed by it. Modern-day Star Trek fans are embarrassed by it, but it's true. Star Trek: The Motion Picture was rated G. So beyond the mysterious cabal at the MPA who had rated the film G the day before yesterday, only about a half dozen other people had seen the movie so far, including Jerry Goldsmith, director Wise, and his editor Todd Ramsey. Otherwise, the first people on Earth to see the most hyped film of 1979 would be the 850 souls at the MacArthur Theater, approximately one for every theater the film would be opening in the next morning. Wise had been told that he absolutely had to deliver the finished product to the lab at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer by midnight on Friday, November 30th. But he was still dubbing in the soundtrack at 2:30 a.m. and viewing composite reels at 3 a.m. He returned at noon on Saturday to fix a problem in the sound negative, reviewed the backup sound at 6 that evening, and finally stepped back and let the printing of the reels begin. A few days later, he visited Stage 12 at MGM, which Paramount had rented so they'd have somewhere to lay out the few thousand containers, which held several thousand reels of freshly minted film. Of those completed prints, 360 began shipping on Monday, another 300 went out on Tuesday, and the rest had gone out on Wednesday. Now, there is this legend among Star Trek fans that Robert Wise, that the print of the film that he brought to the MacArthur premiere was dripping wet because the special effects had just been delivered. They'd just been put in, they just arrived. And the version shown at the premiere was the very first one to be fully printed. Not true, not true at all. It had been completed earlier in the week. And by the time of the premiere, you see right there, those were all being sent out to the theaters across the country. Taking no chances with their investment, Paramount gave each of the cans an additional lead seal, and upon arrival, exhibitors were instructed to report back any evidence of tampering with the closely inventoried and only somewhat toxic lock. They further applied pressure via a letter which warned that should a piracy case develop with the movie and a subsequent FBI investigation were to connect a given theater with that case, the Mountain would make use of all legal remedies available to punish the exhibitor. The letter also recommended that the theater manager hold a staff meeting to emphasize that every security measure would be required from anyone who so much as breathed near the print. Paramount would later send undercover operatives working with the MPAA's film security office out to theaters, offering big monies for copies of the film to see how long it would take for a bootleg to appear on the market. For the MacArthur premiere, Wise protected his ever so premature baby by bringing a print on the plane the night before and keeping it locked in his hotel room. In and of itself, hand-delivering films was nothing new for Wise. In January 1941, while editing Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, the greatest film ever made as of 1979, and it still is as of 2022, in spite of the British Film Institute having displaced it with Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. And Vertigo isn't even Hitchcock's best film, let alone the best film by anyone ever, but that's a matter for another book. And the name of that other book is Beautiful Ghosts, my most recent book. It's a memoir, came out last year, and I explain in great detail why Citizen Kane is still a better film than Vertigo. But anyway, in January 1941, while editing Citizen Kane, Wise had flown with a work print for 60 hours in a blizzard to a private preview screen for RKO executives and attorneys at Radio City Music Hall. During production on Star Trek The Motion Picture, Wise spoke highly of Welles when prompted and hired his former boss to narrate the teaser trailer. Yes, that's right. Wise had personally brought prints to 2 premieres of his own pictures in more recent decades, but of the 38 films in his 35-year directorial career, this was the first to not have any test screenings. The MacArthur projectionist had picked up the print earlier that day, so there was nothing Wise could do now except deal with the sense of gnawing dread that the film was not ready for mass consumption. It needed more work, a shakedown cruise, or at least previews with an audience. Just a few more weeks to see all the elements put together in order to figure out what worked and what didn't. But the premiere date of December 7th, 1979 had been etched in stone ever since Paramount sent out bid letters to theaters on December 8th, 1978, the furthest in advance a film had ever been optioned for bidding, let alone a film that was still in principal photography. The letters came with a promotional packet which contained as much information as Paramount was able, or at least willing, to reveal. The theaters were given until December 28th, 1978 to place their bids. Several hundred had done so, and now the rubber was about to meet the road. The picture was going to be consumed en masse, and it bore Robert Wise's name. Sure, it was tied with Gene Roddenberry's producer credit, which was contractually required to come before Wise's director credit, hence them sharing a title screen with Roddenberry's name on top, while official Paramount press materials awkwardly referred to it as a Gene Roddenberry production, a Robert Wise film. Wise and Roddenberry's shared title screen was not as much of an indication of equal collaboration as the screen that Wells shared with cinematographer Greg Toland on Kane, to put it mildly. But there was a real possibility that this could prove to be less like Wise's 1965 triumph, The Sound of Music, starring Julie Andrews, and more like his 1969 misfire, Star, starring Julie Andrews. And at least those had Julie Andrews. And Wise would look back on Star's reception as his biggest disappointment, since he considered it to be a better film and a greater achievement than it was given credit for. This was not an opinion he would hold of Star Trek, the motion picture. Star had also been his last film to be released as a roadshow, but those days were long gone. Star Trek, the motion picture, would immediately go into release at popular prices, and nothing could be done to stop it. Meanwhile, final preparations for the premiere were underway at the MacArthur Theater. Located in the Palisades neighborhood of Washington and designed by famed theater architect John J. Zink in the Art Moderne style, the single-screen 1,000-seat movie palace was completed in 1946 for a then hefty $125,000. The first film shown was the Errol Flynn vehicle Never Say Goodbye on Christmas Day. And after a few years as one of the classier second-run theaters in town, in the early 1950s, the MacArthur morphed into an art house which primarily showed British comedies, from lowbrow favorites such as the Carry On series to the higher-class Ealing Studios pictures starring Alec Guinness. And this wasn't the first time in recent memory the MacArthur had hosted a high-profile premiere. President Carter had attended Hall Bartlett's The Children of Sanchez a few months earlier. But even the logistics of protecting a sitting president, such as installing special phone lines, weren't as much work as was being put into the premiere of this movie based on a long-canceled television show. Nor were any stones being left, no stones were left unspruced inside, as the MacArthur's terrazzo floors were mopped and the chrome was shined. An additional candy counter was installed, and a dozen palm trees gave the lobby and its tasteful rose-colored marble panels that extra bit of ersatz Hollywood pizzazz. As for the presentation of the hitherto unseen movie itself, the chief engineer of Samuel Goldwyn Studios had flown in from Los Angeles on Wednesday and stayed until past midnight to work on the sound system, while film editor Todd Ramsey, who is a bit of a villain in this piece later on, checked the theater's acoustics, and shiny new lenses were installed on the projectors. On the 35mm projectors, to be precise. The intention had always been to release the film in both 35mm and 70mm, and spectacular Paramount trademark sound. Very important detail there. And many of the upgrades Robert Wise made to the bridge of the Enterprise were so it would stand up to the scrutiny of 70mm exhibition. But it had become apparent by mid-November that just producing enough 35mm prints for December 7th would be tricky enough, and there was no way the more challenging 70mm prints were going to happen in time. Never mind any promises which may have been made to the paying exhibitors. It was less of an issue for the MacArthur, which was already equipped for 70mm projection, and that it was going to be a 35mm print just meant one less variable. It was far more annoying for exhibitors who had made the costly upgrades specifically for this movie. In addition to the $1.25 million for the guarantee to show the movie at their 8 other theaters in California, Nevada, and Utah, the Ray Sweeky Company had spent $32,000 to convert the Century 22B theater in San Jose to 70mm, and advance tickets were on sale at the local Bass outlet. And boy, I'm not going to pour this one out, but I'd just like to pour one out for the Century 22B theater. I love that theater so much. My gosh. But it wasn't just major exhibitors flunking down large sums for the film. Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak was such a fan that he had 36 videotapes of Star Trek, even though they weren't yet commercially available. But he was also still smarting from not getting to see Star Wars or Alien on their respective opening nights. So he paid over $3,000 for 691 seats at $4.50 each for the Robert Wise's film opening night at the Century 22B, as well as a few other nights. Woz then turned around and sold about half of them to Apple employees for $10 each. So never let it be said that his partner, Steve Jobs, was the only capitalist between them. Oh, Woz, you seem so benign now. So Next up is a section called The Starship of the 1970s Future. Starlog 12 went on sale on January 17, 1978, and it included a David Hutchison article about the changes made to the Enterprise to make it state-of-the-art. Here and elsewhere, a great deal of attention was paid to how the sets and props were now practical, meaning when a cast member pressed a button, things happened in response. Quote, "This new development will force the actors to have a more natural manner of dealing with the equipment, since as they throw a switch, they'll have to wait to see if the proper indicators light up to show properly functioning machinery," unquote. So a light switch by any other name. Other elements were pie-in-the-sky ideas, which almost certainly couldn't have been achieved on the budget of either a series or a movie at the time, such as how one section of the bridge, quote, "incorporates a large glassy hemisphere, which will be rigged with crosshairs to aid enemy targeting," which became the far more toned-down weapons console operated by Chekhov, the operation of which remained fuzzy on screen. Quote, "Background viewers on the bridge will suggest futuristic instrumentation by specially produced laser light displays and computer animation," unquote, and many of those viewers, quote, "will be running continuously, indicating the operational status of the ship and its position in space," unquote. In the Robert Wise film, this was reduced to film loops being projected onto small, impractical oval screens from behind the set, the inherent dimness of which resulted in the often murky cinematography of the bridge scenes. Hutchison's source for these details is unclear. Some of it may have been active disinformation from Paramount, though it's easy to picture Gene Roddenberry reclining at his desk, rattling off these ideas as they came to mind, such as, "The main viewplate has been removed. Visual communications will be achieved via large holographic projections suspended in the area in front of the captain's chair. Additionally, it will no longer be necessary for officers to come in person to the conference room, but instead will be able to attend via a holographic projection," unquote. Reading it now, this sounds not unlike the use of holograms in the Star Wars universe, though their use for two-way communication wouldn't be established until 1980's The Empire Strikes Back. On the same page in Starlog 12 was a Trek update sidebar reporting Paramount's announcement that the first 2-hour episode of Star Trek II will be produced as a feature film for theatrical distribution, and that the November 28th start date had been pushed back to March to allow extra time to complete the sets. Okay, sidebar here. If there had been a Star Trek movie in the 1970s, it would have been released to theaters under the name Star Trek II, which was always what Gene Roddenberry thought of the Star Trek revival. For him, it was always Star Trek II. That's what he considered the new version of Star Trek to be. So the movie would have been called either Star Trek II or Star Trek the Motion Picture, which was what ended up being called and what Paramount wanted it. But it would not have been called Star Trek the God Thing. It would not have been called Star Trek Planet of the Titans. It would have been called Star Trek II or Star Trek the Motion Picture. The TV series that didn't happen and that evolved into the movie would not have been called Star Trek Phase 2. Had it existed, it would have been called Star Trek II. It's just what it would have been called at the time. Star Trek Phase 2 is a name that Paramount retroactively assigned to it in the 1990s to differentiate it from Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which everyone but me considers to be the best Star Trek film of all time. But Gene Roddenberry always wanted this 1970s Star Trek revival to be called Star Trek II. And that's why continuing here. And while the Star Trek II premiere had been pushed back to the fall of 1978 before the Paramount television service itself fell into oblivion, quote, "Producer Gene Roddenberry and Paramount currently do not foresee Star Trek returning to television on a weekly basis until 1 year after the theatrical release of Star Trek II." When that theatrical release would be was still up for grabs, but work on the Enterprise sets didn't falter, nor did Gene Roddenberry's conviction that fans wanted those sets to have functioning buttons. February 1978 was perhaps the time of Star Trek the Motion Picture's greatest flux, which is saying a lot, but also the time in which much of how the Enterprise would operate going forward was nailed down in a 44-page document created by graphic designer Lee Cole titled Enterprise Flight Manual. It provided instructions for all the major controls on the bridge, engineering, and sickbay, the logic being that since the controls were practical, it was necessary for the cast to know how they worked, quote unquote. That main cast was not yet to include Leonard Nimoy, as the science station controls are described as being for Zahn or subordinates. And while there are a few elements not included in the final product, a close study of the first 3 motion pictures shows that the controls as they existed in February 1978 were, for all intents and purposes, the final product, though some cosmetic changes would be made to accommodate both the story and aesthetic needs of the second and third films, which disregard Cole's flight manual. 10 years later, production designer Joe Jennings acknowledged that the sets were far more complicated than they needed to be. Quoting Jennings here, "The Enterprise's bridge was designed to go into series." Actually, I'm going to go back to this for a second. "The Enterprise's bridge was designed to go into series, so we were designing it to be all things to all people. As a result, all of the devices were practical and worked off proximity switches. You didn't have to touch the board, but simply had to reach toward it, and whatever effect you were tripping would show up on the board. We were asked to design a set that would function for at least 3 years of shows, so we were being much more sophisticated than perhaps we would have been if it were just a feature film. Then you only build things that operate properly." End quote. On the subject of things which operated properly, producer Robert Goodwin had contracted Paramount subsidiary Magicam in September 1977 to build the models for the Star Trek II premiere, specifically the Klingon ship, V'ger, the orbital dry dock, the space office complex, and the space office complex, while the Enterprise herself was being built by Don Luce of Brick Price Movie Miniatures. Come December, the people at Magicam began to sense that things were changing when the television production was put on hold, and it was confirmed in January 1978 when, as Magicam's chief model builder Jim Dow later described it, an entourage from Robert Abel and Associates, quote, "came roaring through our shop, informing us that there was no way in hell that any of the things we built could be utilized for a feature. It all had to be scrapped," unquote. Magicam's models were put into storage, and Abel and Associates functionally took over the production, though since Magicam was a Paramount subsidiary, the Mountain decided to keep them on as well. Yeah, no, let's just enjoy this unfinished model of what would have been the Star Trek II Enterprise there. What might have been. And now we're going to switch over to presenting Persis Khambatta. And this book is about her entire life, from beginning to, way too soon end, including her being Miss India in the 60s and the way being involved with Star Trek. It did not help. I mean, on the one hand, if she hadn't been in this movie, we wouldn't be talking about her now. On the other hand, if she hadn't been in this movie, she might have lived a happier life, all things considered. And also something to bear in mind going forward is that her character of Ilea is murdered halfway through the film and is replaced by a robot, who's pictured on the cover of the book there. So I'm going to make the distinction going forward between real Ilea and robot Ilea. And so this first section is called The Eternal August Part 4, Rush Hour on the Event Horizon. Shooting began on the wormhole sequence on Friday, August 18th, 1978. Real Ilea gets the most to do in this scene because she delivers most of the sacrosanct technological exposition. It does not develop her character per se, but at least we get to see that Ilea is good at her job in the most trying of circumstances. Ramsey and his moviola be damned. Ilea counting down to the Enterprise's collision with the asteroid was shot on August 22nd, and during one take, she skipped from 4 to 2, leading Chekhov actor Walter Koenig to write in his diary. The set breaks up. The entire company is on the floor. Persis is aghast. She sticks her tongue out, cross-eyed, stares down at it accusingly. 2 things about beautiful women. 1, even cross-eyed, they look beautiful. 2, when they make a mistake in their dialogue, it's their tongue's fault, not theirs. End quote. Khambatta's was not the only tongue tripping over the unspeakable dialogue, but all was forgiven when she threw a party for 30 members of the cast and crew the following night at an East Indian restaurant called Gypsies, even if the food proved too spicy for some of the more delicate palates. There's a million little things and big things, but a million little things that I love about Persis Khambatta, and one of them is she not only loves spicy food, she loves spicy finger food. The messier the food was, if it got all over her fingers and face, nothing made her happier. It's like, oh, I just adore that so much. She's my aunt that I never met. That's how I think of Persis Khambatta. I love her like an aunt. that I never got to meet. That Ailea's character, so here we go. That Ailea's character began and ended with her body came through in very subtle ways, including in the visual effects of the wormhole sequence. Effects production coordinator Michelle Small explained to Preston Neal Jones that Ailea, quote, was conceived to be the most sensual and sensitive of creatures according to the script's stage directions. But it was never made clear, quote, how absolutely alluring and sensitive she really is. Quote continues. And I thought, well, it's really important to somehow subliminalize that and at least somehow get across the fact that machines like her too. So during the wormhole sequence, one of the fake lights, which is what we call the lights streaking off the panels and consoles, whenever the cut is back to Ailea, the light is coming up and touching her breasts very gently, as if they're going, nice, nice. It is probably not a coincidence that the energy tendrils of the probe, which murders Ailea, also favor Khambatta's breasts. But none of the effects crew copped to this one. But yeah, that's not accidental. So the publicity machine began gearing up in October 1978 with a Los Angeles magazine article titled, "A New Farrah She Isn't." The Farrah in question was Fawcett, who was iconic for a poster featuring her big hair and a prominent nipple. Y'all know what that looks like. I'm not going to show you. Most of you are already picturing that poster, so you're good. The article began by insisting that, quote, not since Vidal Sassoon jetted in from London to snip Mia Farrow's hair for Rosemary's Baby has there been such a fuss about a lady losing her tresses, unquote. They were not wrong about that. And though Khambatta had just turned 32, it was no small victory that the magazine's writer called her, quote, the 27-year-old black-eyed and once black-haired Khambatta. For the record, Persis Khambatta's eyes were brown, not black. Roderick Mann followed up his coverage of Khambatta's shave and her subsequent unnatural baldness in the October 10th Los Angeles Times. Bald is beautiful. How fair is Persis Khambatta, the Indian actress who shaved her head completely bald for her role in the $15 million movie version of Star Trek, directed by Robert Wise? Just fine, it seems. Whereas some actresses, similarly shorn, might have gone into hiding when not actually working on the set, Persis walks around as if it's perfectly natural for a woman to be bald. Of course, she does get kissed on the top of her head by other cast members. End quote. Of course she does. It was 1978 after all. Khambatta described how sensual it felt to shower in the morning, an anecdote she would use a great deal in the year to come, while also expressing confidence that her current baldness would cease to be an issue. I'll never be typecast, because I'll never look like this again. The second half was true, though Khambatta would stay on Mann's mind for the next few years. Writing about an actor who'd shaved his head for a Broadway play, which closed after one night in April 1979, Mann mused that, quote, maybe Indian actress Persis Khambatta, who shaved her head for her role in Star Trek, could lend him one of her wigs. Persis never wore wigs in public. While she was bald, she went out. She would like sometimes like wear caps and like, jewelry and stuff, but she never wore a wig. She was never embarrassed to be bald. She owned it. And again, God, I love her so much for that. Khambatta was featured prominently in a much longer article by Wayne Warga in the October 15th, 1978 Los Angeles Times. Describing herself as a very lucky lady, she can state that she was not afraid of being typecast, quote, because all I have to do is grow my hair back, unquote, while swerving into the Farrah comparison and her tendency to be compared to others. Quote, this is me, right down to the skin. Farrah Fawcett Majors has too much hair. I'm making up for her. Newsweek once called me the Sophia Loren of India. I am always being compared. Now I am no one but me. And you cannot imagine how marvelous it feels to take a shower, to get that tingling when the water hits you. End quote. Between the publications of the 2 Times pieces with her glowing shower anecdotes came the filming of a make-believe shower about which her feelings were considerably more mixed. Robot Ailea's first appearance on October 11th. Though Khambatta had long since made it clear to Roddenberry that she did not want to do the scene naked, the stage directions in the October 9th revision specified that, quote, we see behind the translucent stall door what is unmistakably the form of a nude female. Kirk, quote, reacts as he sees the naked form, and even Spock, quote, cannot help repressing an expression of surprise. I mean, really, all that's missing is the boing sound. Good God, Roddenberry, fucking Roddenberry. After again noting that, quote, Kirk's eyes cannot believe what he is seeing, unquote, the first description of robot Ilea is that she is, quote, naked but for a small multicolored button embedded in her throat. Now, while I have no evidence that Gene Roddenberry was a fan of candid camera producer Alan Funt in general, and Alan Funt's 1970 film, What Do You Say to a Naked Lady in particular, I am nonetheless certain of those two things. Two more certain things. Roddenberry knew that the beam-splitting effect used to create the rippled light on the door of the sonic shower would obscure Khambatta's body on film. And even if it didn't, he knew Paramount would never release this high-profile, mega-budgeted film with unobscured frontal nudity. But Roddenberry wanted to see Khambatta naked, and he wasn't the only Gene who wanted it. The Chicago Tribune's Siskel wrote in his "It's Just Okay" review of the film in December 1979 that Khambatta, quote, is something special, unquote, and as stunning as Bo Derek in 10, unquote. God, 1979. And when she wasn't on screen, quote, the film teeters towards being a crashing bore. Okay, Gene Siskel wasn't wrong about that, but he then parenthetically lamented that, unfortunately, Star Trek is rated G and Khambatta never gets down to basics. Khambatta was determined to avoid getting down to basics, so she asked Robert Wise to let her wear a body stocking. Roddenberry objected to the stocking because the seams would show, so Khambatta asked the wardrobe department to put the seams and the zipper on the side facing away from the camera. Roddenberry next objected to the lack of nipples, so Khambatta asked the seamstress to add buttons in the appropriate places and asked Jana Phillips, one of the makeup artists, to darken the buttons until they looked realistic. Then came Roddenberry's final, most airtight objection. The whole film would fall apart if this robot replica of the murdered Delton woman did not show full bush. Thankfully, Wise stepped in and put the kibosh on that. As annoying as it was for Roddenberry to not get to see Khambatta's celebrity skin, Courtney Love shout out, nothing can ruin a producer's day like having to jump through hoops to not kill his leading lady. Over a quarter ton of dry ice was used to provide the moisture of the sonic shower, and filming was delayed by Khambatta stepping out of the carbon dioxide vapor on a regular basis in order to not die. Now, you may ask why a sonic shower, which by definition uses sound waves, would create moisture. Yes, you may well ask. Even more annoying was how the stocking, which Roddenberry didn't want her to wear in the first place, provided no protection against the heavier than oxygen 109 degrees below Fahrenheit vapor, which gathered at her bare feet, resulting in her developing a case of tonsillitis, which required Wise to change the shooting schedule for the rest of the week. As though causing that delay wasn't unprofessional enough of Khambatta, she often caught colds during filming, even when she wasn't standing in a cloud of dry ice. Wise and Roddenberry were concerned for her health insofar as a lost day of production cost thousands of dollars, but they would not let her cover her head between takes because of the makeup. Khambatta's first day standing in the freezing poisonous vapor was also her first day wearing the light in the hollow of her throat, which was powered by a battery on her back and connected by wires covered with makeup. The metal doodad heated up as predicted by the first law of thermodynamics when turned on, and Khambatta would cry out, "Switch it off! Switch it off!" It was also discovered at the end of the day in which Khambatta was being simultaneously frozen at the feet and burned at the throat that the light left a red burn mark on her throat as predicted by the second law of thermodynamics. A plaster impression of Jana Phillips's throat had been used to test the light, but nobody thought to test it on a human until Khambatta wore it as the cameras rolled. But what could be done? They couldn't not use an unreliable incandescent light which seared Khambatta's flesh, so the production grudgingly provided Khambatta with a switch hidden in her sleeve, allowing her to turn it on and off herself. Yes, great men doing great things. That's the story of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. When Khambatta returned to the set on October 18th, she was clothed, if only just the short white garment referred to in the script as a leisure robe, with a high collar intended to emphasize both her bald head and the burning light in her neck. Regarding the leisure robe's all but non-existent hemline, costume designer Robert Fletcher admitted to the Los Angeles Times that he felt such mini-skirted garments were only good for shock value and occasionally pulling us out of fashion doldrums, and that he used the look for obvious reasons, to show a very good pair of legs. Fletcher was in a loftier mood when speaking to Cinefantastique's Preston Neal Jones, saying he was trying to create, quote, an ironic juxtaposition of a sexually attractive figure with the soul of a machine, unquote. In order to demonstrate that machine soul, Robert Wise did not allow Persis Khambatta to blink as Robot Ilea, even though a big deal is made in the film about how the robot is a perfect replica of the murdered Delton woman, down to the eye moisture. So by the film's own logic, there's no reason for her not to blink. Now, this is not to say that Roddenberry and Wise made no sacrifices for Khambatta's physical comfort. She was allowed to wear pants between takes. But Persis Khambatta was a good soldier, so she did not emphasize the painful scorching of her flesh or the rigors of carbon dioxide poisoning when speaking to the press, but instead the more titillating aspects. In an article in the October 28, 1978 India West, she again described the wonderful feeling of showering when bald as so different, so sensual, so smooth. The production was already several weeks behind schedule on November 7th, and progress was further stymied by Gene Roddenberry and his co-screenwriter Harold Livingston continuing to rewrite each other on a daily and sometimes hourly basis. I have seen the shooting scripts for this film. I've seen like God bless Dr. McCoy actor DeForest Kelley, because he kept every version of the script, and I went through them at the Margaret Herrick Library in Los Angeles. And yeah, they would Roddenberry and Livingston would just be constantly rewriting each other, and lines are crossed out and scribbled, and it was a pissing contest. It was a dick waving contest between Roddenberry and Livingston, and it did not help the film. It really didn't at all. Anyway, when George Anthony from the Yukon White Horse Star visited the set on one of those mid-November days, he witnessed an exchange between Kirk and Robot Ilea, which was never used in any version of the film. It would have occurred when William Shatner says, "V'ger, V'ger," while breathing down Persis Khambatta's neck, both literally and figuratively. And according to Anthony, and confirmed by the shooting script, Kirk's unspeakably purple line was, "If we are lesser beings, we are still, like you, living. And, like you, because we are alive, we wish to survive." Sidebar, I don't do William Shatner impressions, and I can happily go the rest of my life never hearing a William Shatner impression again. Just throwing that out there. Robert Wise then called for a break, but Shatner turned into a conference where he was less concerned with the terrible dialogue than with the manner in which he manhandles Khambatta. From the article, "Bob, the body movement doesn't feel right," said Shatner. "It's just too static. Should I turn when she speaks, or should I turn just before? Isn't it more powerful if she turns now?" Ms. Khambatta pivoted slowly on one foot, "as if she's so strong that I can't hold her?" "Yes," said Wise, nodding his head thoughtfully. "Yes, I agree with you. Let's try it." End of excerpt. This day was probably the source of a still photograph which did not accompany the article, but would be used to promote the film over the years. Khambatta as Robot Ilea is facing the camera, but looking to the left of the lens, while William Shatner stands in profile to her left, Shatner's hairy left arm in front of Khambatta as he clutches her right shoulder, while Stephen Collins looms above and behind Khambatta, and Leonard Nimoy is almost visible in the background. The photo is murky, confounding, and unpleasant, which can also be said of the corresponding sequence in the film. As late as the November 5th script revisions, real Ilea's corpse was found on the walk to Voyager 6, her, quote, eyes closed, hanging within the glowing cube, limp, motionless. McCoy's tricorder finds no life reading, and Robot Ilea says the corpse is being preserved for further study. Decker is shaken to the depths of his emotions, so not very far at all, by seeing the corpse of his former lover and her robot replacement in the same place, but he has no choice but to follow robot Ilea and the others, glancing back regretfully at Ilea's body hanging lifeless. The life-size fiberglass replica of Khambatta, which Rick Stratton and Mick Valley built for this scene, was later incorporated into Spock's trip into V'ger. Douglas Trumbull told Don Shea in the inaugural issue of Cinefex in 1980 that he conducted a photo session of the Ilea mannequin at an unflattering angle with, quote, a combination of blue lights and red lights and rims and kickers. I love that, rims and kickers. All kinds of things, and got some really striking, beautiful photographs. Those photographs were blown into 16 by 20 color prints, retouched a bit more, and then filmed on an animation stand. Seeing Ilea fully clothed once more is a breath of fresh air, and it is the only time Robert Fletcher's fugly Starfleet uniform is a welcome sight in the first Star Trek film, even in the context of Ilea's murdered body. But as necrophilic as the image already is, it could have been even more violent. Aerospace artist Robert McCall designed Spock's trip into V'ger, and Ilea's head is vertically bisected in his original conception of the sequence, as printed in the 1982 book Vision of the Future, The Art of Robert McCall. By the time of the November 29th script revisions, the climax plays out much as it does in the film. Real Ilea's corpse is not found. Robot Ilea and Decker give each other sexy looks during the V'ger merge, and the denouement, Kirk wistfully changes real Ilea's status from casualty to missing. This is a lie because she was straight up killed by V'ger. The film takes great pains to establish that Decker consented to his fate. It's like they make it real fucking clear, he wanted this. While real Ilea died with a look of horror while being physically assaulted by an alien probe. Associate producer John Proville, this guy, told Preston Neal Jones at the time, quote, I'm not sure, but I think it was my idea that Ilea joined in the fusing. I know that I was always anti bringing her back. I know it's hard to believe that he would be against bringing Ilea back, but there you go. And this, of course, ignores that it was robot Ilea who joins in the fusing, and thus real Ilea could have been brought back because you can do that in science fiction. The third and best Star Trek film bends over backwards to bring back Spock after he is killed in the second movie. But Proville prevailed, and the Deltan woman remained dead when the credits rolled at the end of the first Star Trek movie. Ilea was murdered. Never forget. And this is from a section called The Eternal August Part 5, The Blinding of Persis. Designed by Harold Michelson and built on Paramount Stage 15, Voyager 6 was the first Star Trek movie's most dangerous set. The wiring was complicated and overtaxed, and 2 technicians received an electric shock, which might have proved lethal had a third crew member not tackled them. It was a death trap even beyond the risk of electrocution. The fragile floor was 60 feet off the ground, with about 30 people underneath to run the lights, and the wrong place to step on the elevated set was often indistinguishable from the right place until it was too late. The steps down to Voyager 6 itself were small, steep, and slippery, and those small, steep, slippery steps switched from side to side, so walking straight down was not an option. Rugged male leads William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, DeForest Kelley, and Stephen Collins were playing characters with practical footwear who were allowed to look where they were going, while Khambatta was saddled with the sort of ungainly footwear which had disqualified her from the Miss Universe contest 14 years earlier. So yeah, after winning Miss India in 1965, she went on to the Miss Universe pageant in Miami, and she was disqualified because one of the rounds she was required, they're all required to wear stiletto heels, and she had never worn heels before. She was considered, she was considered tall for her culture and in general, so she'd never felt the need to be taller, so she'd never worn heels, and she borrowed a pair from one of the other contestants, but they gave her blisters and just became a whole thing. And rather than not forcing someone from a culture that doesn't have high heels to wear high heels, they just disqualified her. Miss Universe, good people doing good things. Anyway, she also had to maintain perfect posture while looking straight ahead at all times, even though Robot Ilea was a perfect replica of a murdered Delton woman who had the physical ability to look down. As such, when Khambatta first saw the set, she thought to herself, "I'm going to die." Though stuntwoman Paula Christ appeared elsewhere in the film in a non-Ilea scene, Khambatta did all her own stunts, unlike William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. Once again, having nobody to advocate for her self-interest or basic safety, Khambatta asked if she could have a wire or something. It was a reasonable request, but Robert Wise instead decided to get his Eisenstein on and use montage to imply robot Ilea's descent. She begins walking down for a few seconds, and then there are about 10 seconds of cut to Voyager 6 and the Enterprise's landing parter, and then voila, she's at the bottom of the steps. Yep, there you go. Look at that. That's how that works. There had been much concern throughout the production that the audience would be confused by things which would have made the film interesting to look at. If there's any color in the uniforms, the viewer will be so distracted they won't pay any attention to the dialogue. If the walls of the bridge can be moved to make room for cameras and lights, the viewer will no longer believe they're on a spaceship. These were actual concerns that they had, and this is why the film is so ugly to look at. It's drab people in drab surroundings doing drab things because, again, any hint of color or anything interesting to look like, they thought the audience would be distracted. Last thing you want to do in your big $44 million movie is entertain the audience. You don't want to do that. But of all the criticisms leveled at the first Star Trek movie, nobody has ever asked how robot Ilea walked down those steps without the audience seeing her doing so. Even so, the film's second greatest stunt is those 10 seconds as Khambatta walks across the level but still fragile set to Voyager 6's right here, to Voyager 6's much sturdier platform. That is the second greatest stunt. For the record, it is a greater stunt than William Shatner's double falling ass over tea kettle after robot Ilea pushes Kirk away, though it is nowhere near as satisfying to watch. Again, most Star Trek fans, and particularly Star Trek fans of a certain age, will tell you that the greatest moment is William Shatner yelling Khan. I disagree entirely. This right here is the greatest moment, at the very least, in the first two Star Trek films. It's also the only time in which Persis Khambatta is able to use body language to express character about robot Ilea. The fact that she is looking away from Kirk as she pushes him, it's like, oh. As much as I'd like to just have the rest of this just be us watching this over and over, I guess I should move on. Anyway, okay, once more. And, oh, so good, so good. Anyway, Khambatta has three major close-ups in the film, two of which are tied to entrances. The first is real Ilea's entrance onto the bridge, which lasts for about a second before cutting to the reaction of the menfolk. Next is robot Ilea in the sonic shower for about 11 seconds, which we've talked about at length, during which she has dialogue and moves her head. The third is her most impressive and the film's best stunt, running for a whopping 15 seconds, I'm going to have it on loop here, while Kirk and Spock prattle on about Voyager 6 finding the machine planet. Khambatta has no dialogue, but being a human in high heels with a burning piece of metal attached to her throat and a large camera a few inches from her face, her body cannot help but wobble. Her eyes do not have the wide 1,000-yard stare as seen in many other shots, and a bit of character leaks through in those 15 seconds. The lack of an arc for either real Ilea or robot Ilea is one of the many ways the first Star Trek movie fails as a character piece. But for a non-character who is supposed to be doing nothing, Khambatta's physical suffering during that close-up reads as robot Ilea's wheels turning, mental wheels turning. Speaking of Persis Khambatta in pain, which is synonymous with speaking of Persis Khambatta in the first Star Trek movie, her final day of shooting almost proved to be her final day of seeing. Friday, January 26th, 1979. Brian Longbotham told Preston Neal Jones at the time that the melding sequence was lit with two 4,000-watt xenon lights built for drive-in theater projectors and two 300-watt lights designed for helicopter searchlights. And Longbotham's partner Sam Nicholson noted that everyone involved in the sequence on both sides of the camera got sunburned. Only sunburned if they were lucky. After 3.5 months of playing a robot who was a perfect replica of a murdered Delton woman down to the eye moisture, which, Deltons blink to replenish, and yet being told by Robert Wise that robots don't blink, even when they're perfect replicas of murdered Deltons who do blink, nobody told Khambatta that she should close her eyes when thousands of watts of light was pointed at her. As Brian Longbotham put it, quote, Persis was so into the reality of the situation that she kept her eyes open as the turntables slowly spun them around, and she looked directly into the lights, which she shouldn't have. Yeah, you think? Shooting for Khambatta and Collins, who had closed his eyes, wrapped at 10:30, and Khambatta woke up at 2 a.m. with her eyes burning. When she was able to open her eyes, she could only see black, and justifiably freaked out, she had her neighbor call Paramount, who in turn sent her to UCLA. And yes, she did not call, she did not call 911, not call the hospital immediately. She called Paramount. That's how the studio system worked in those days. Something goes wrong, you call us. You don't call outsiders just yet. At UCLA, Khambatta was told that it was a kind of snow blindness. And since her only real exposure to snow had been during her winters in London and New York, she was unsure how this differed from the regular blindness it felt like. The doctors bandaged her eyes and told her not to worry about it. Her vision returned after 2 days. Army Archer noted in the January 30th Daily Variety that Khambatta was wearing a patch over her left eye. Though she got splitting headaches for the next week and had to wear dark glasses in the sun for the next few months. And this image was used a lot to promote the film, sent out to newspapers, and it's not inappropriate. Caught in a blinding shaft of light in a scene from the film. That's truth in journalism right there. But Persis Khambatta knew it was all worth it. From shaving her head to burning her neck, from tonsillitis to blindness, she knew that these were all temporary sacrifices to achieve permanent stardom. Oh, Auntie. The first Star Trek movie's wrap party was held at the Chez Moi Disco on February 10th, and Susan Sackett wrote in Starlog that Khambatta, quote, plans to spend the next several months growing back her shiny black hair. Seems there aren't too many parts for Deltons in Hollywood. Though nobody would ever let her forget she had been bald in that one movie that one time, the true stumbling block to a Hollywood career would not be her make-believe ethnicity on screen, but her real-life ethnicity, combined with her stubborn refusal to be naked below the neck. So yeah, that's all in this book. And now just to close things out on slightly less dark kind of mood, this is one more section for Star Trek movie. This is about opening day, December 7th, 1979, Star Trek Manifest Procession Part 1, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Florida. As a result of a New York Daily News ad on November 16th, the first line to buy tickets formed outside the Paramount Theater at 10 p.m. on Tuesday, November 20th, 1979, with a Captain Kirk in front. The line was soon 24 strong, and the Mountain provided the early buyers with Star Trek sleeping bags. By the time the box office opened the following morning, the queue was several hundred people long. One of the first known lines to actually see the film after the MacArthur premiere was not at the Paramount Theater, but the nearby Lowe's State One Theater at 45th and Broadway. Exactly when it formed is uncertain, but the Lowe's divisional manager had to be rousted from bed at 5:30 in the morning to do crowd control, and the line stretched 4 blocks by the time of the premiere showing at 9 a.m. One of the things I established in this book is that the blockbuster release pattern, as well as we knew it up until 2020 at least, began with this movie. We tend to think of Jaws and Star Wars, and okay, those loosened the pickle jar a little bit, but the big blockbuster release everywhere, lines around the block, all that stuff, that really and truly began with Star Trek the Motion Picture. And the reason that I know this is because everywhere it played, or all the newspapers I could find, the local newspapers just went nuts. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. It was just crazy. So all these details were recorded at the time. The first 3 public showings were in Lowe's theaters, the second being at 10 a.m. upstairs from the State One at the State Two, and the third was at 10:30 a.m. at the Lowe's Orpheum at 86th and 3rd. These were all before the noon showing at the Paramount, though everyone in the Paramount line already had their tickets. The State one also had the widest range of showtimes on Friday and Saturday, the first at 9 a.m. and the last at 2 a.m. Even assuming that final showing started exactly at 2 a.m., which it almost certainly did not, the movie would have finished no sooner than 4:15 a.m., less than 5 hours before the 9 a.m. Saturday showing. If I had a time machine, well, obviously the first thing I'd do would be to go back and kill baby Hitler. But then after that, I would go to Times Square at 4 a.m. on December 8th, 1978, and set up a table with blankets and hot cocoa for the bleary-eyed patrons exiting the State one. It just seems like they would need them. The Lowe's and Paramount theaters were grand movie palaces with decades of history, but Star Trek the Motion Picture was also the debut film in some new theaters in the state of New York on December 7th, 1979. It was the first movie shown at the Sunrise Cinemas in Valley Stream, Long Island, a new multiplex built on the site of the former Sunrise Drive-In, as well as at the not yet finished multiplex in the former Pantry Pride supermarket at the Nanuet Mall South in White Plains. The floors in the Nanuet's 450-seat auditorium were less than a week and a half old. There still wasn't any carpeting, and the 4 other theaters wouldn't open until Christmas week. All the same, the owners took out a full-page ad in the December 7th Journal News proclaiming the Robert Wise film opening that day at Rockland County's newest and only five auditorium complex. It worked, as over 1,000 people showed up for the 3 showings, the earliest of which was at 6 p.m., and the Journal News made sure to dispatch a photographer to get a picture of those lines. Again, I have so many pictures of people in line for this movie because it just blew everyone's minds that this movie based on a TV show that was canceled 10 years ago, people are going nuts for it. And the newspapers just ate it up. It was good stuff. The Town Theater in Latham also drew the biggest crowds manager Jerry Hayes had ever witnessed, with all 800 seats selling out. Though the box office didn't open until 6:30 p.m., the audience began lining up outside the Cameo Theater in Binghamton at 1 p.m. for the 7 p.m. premiere showing, while the line for the 9:45 p.m. showing began shortly after 7 p.m., and a photograph of that line was printed in the following day's Press and Sun Bulletin. Lines wound through the Arnott Mall in Elmira, where the Residence Cinema had 6 showings starting at noon on Friday and Saturday, including a late show at 11 p.m. on both nights. The queue for one showing formed before the previous showing was even half over, which was a new enough phenomenon to be frequently mentioned in local newspaper articles about the Robert Wise film. The Star Gazette printed a picture of the Arnott Mall cinema line and noted that some people were there because it was a good excuse to go out on a Friday, others, quote, out of curiosity over the hoopla, while the, quote, few they call the Trekkies, which the paper defined as those who have developed unusual compulsions about the Star Trek television show, were there, quote, because they couldn't help it. That was also a recurring theme in coverage, was that Star Trek was a cult and that these people were being like somehow mind controlled by the TV show and the movie. Are they wrong? I don't know. I'm not going to say. It could be. Showings at the Blue Star Theater down in Watchung, New Jersey began at noon to a half-full house, though one of the attendees was a teenager who was there with his mother, who had sent a note to her son's teacher explaining his whereabouts. The thrill of getting to see the first show was offset by the Blue Star receiving a faulty print, which lacked audible dialogue for the first 15 minutes. Most of that dialogue was in subtitled Klingonese or Vulcan, but that didn't keep the angry patrons from demanding their money back. Just down Route 22 from the Blue Star, the Somerville Circle wasn't faring much better. Though the print's sound was fine, the picture was split in half and flip-flopped, and the manager got booed out of the theater when he asked the patrons to please stay calm. New Jersey, folks. The following day, the Courier News ran a picture of that soon-to-be angry crowd before they entered the theater, clustered in front of an awkward lobby standee featuring cutouts of Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Chapel, Scotty, Uhura, and Sulu, themselves awkwardly clustered together like a promo for a local evening news team. Next to it was a large picture of the Enterprise in which the ship is tilted at a downward angle. It doesn't look like it's sailing into the cosmos so much as it's about to crash back down to Earth. An appropriate visual accompaniment to the article's headline of Science Fiction Film Fails to Send New Jersey Trekkies into Orbit. As opposed to the single student and his mother at the Blue Star, a group of science students were bussed in from Parsippany High for a Friday afternoon show at the Morris Hill Cinema 1, while reservations had already been made for a group of 250 children from Paterson to see it at the Rockaway 6 at the end of the month. The Morris Hill Cinema 1 was among the few local theaters to hold midnight showings, along with the Rockaway. The latter added a midnight show so late in the game it wasn't listed in the Daily Record, though the paper did run a picture of the crowd outside the Morris Hills Cinema 1. The Camden County's Courier Post ran a picture of the lines outside the Cherry Hill Cinema, which had also received one of the ungainly news team standees. Yep, there we go. With Ilea at least, so not all is lost. But the merchandise was selling briskly, and manager Stephen Lauer said he'd never seen such large crowds on an opening day, the first fan having arrived at 8:30 a.m. for a noon show. Lauer expected those kinds of numbers to continue throughout the duration of the 16-week run. And in the shorter term, he added midnight shows on Friday and Saturday, put his ushers and doormen in Star Trek uniforms, and brought in extra guards. Only a single person arrived 3.5 hours early at the Cherry Hill Cinema, but there were 100 blanket-bundled people in line by 7 a.m. at the RKO Stanley Warner Theater in Paramus, New Jersey, for the premiere showing at 1 p.m. By noon, at least 900 of the theater's 1,200 seats were occupied. Though they didn't arrive quite as early, a still respectable 130 grown-ups and 5 children were in the audience for the noon show at the Tatawa Cinema up on Route 46, the first of 6 showings that day instead of the Tatawa's usual 4. As was the case across the country, many fans were playing hooky from work or school to see the first showing. That was part of the thrill of it all. And knowing that people were paying up to $6 for that thrill in New York made the Tatawa's manager feel comfortable upping his usual matinee price from $1.50 to $2 for children and $3 for adults, and the evening shows were up to $4 for adults. In 1979, $4 was a lot to see a movie. The district manager at the RKO Stanley Warner didn't feel it necessary to engage in what in 2018 would be called surge pricing, though he personally sold movie programs to fans in the lobby for $1.50 each. When he opened the doors, people fought over the first copy of the program, even though there were plenty to go around, for Star Trek had been defined by nothing, if not its scarcity. That was why the Fox at 16th and Market in Philadelphia had been receiving regular phone calls about the movie for the past 2 weeks. Some people waited in line all night for the premiere 11 a.m. showing, though whether that line started forming before the line at the Lowe's State One in Manhattan is unknown. By the time the Fox opened at 10:30 a.m., the line was two or three people deep and stretched down to 17th Street past the local porn theaters. Philadelphia Inquirer columnist Murray Dubin noted with some amusement that the people in line, some smoking funny-looking cigarettes, and others doing crossword puzzles or drinking unidentified beverages from bottled bags, were focused on the Robert Wise film and showed no interest in the porn movies. People who had been waiting years to see Star Trek the Motion Picture, not to being lured out of line by Confessions of Linda Lovelace, Hollywood Holly, or Gifts of Love? You've never seen such goings-on. Many theaters were breaking their own rules to accommodate this most anticipated of films. Though mall theaters generally didn't open until the late afternoon, the first showing at the Sarasota Square 6 in Sarasota, Florida, was at 1:30 p.m. And being one of the relatively few multiplexes nationwide to have bid on 2 prints, it would be showing the Robert Wise film on 2 of its 6 screens. Across town, the first showing at the single-screen, non-mall enclosed cinema at Bayshore was at 11:30 a.m., and there would be midnight showings on Friday and Saturday. Down in North Miami Beach, 17-year-old high school senior David Weiss managed a Trek-heavy comic book store called Starship Enterprises. Just mwah! A+ on that name, Mr. Wise. Well done, well done. Weiss had noticed business had picked up since the advertising for the Robert Wise film had begun in earnest that summer, and he was confident that the fandom overall would experience an upsurge if the movie did well. In the shorter term, he was among the many fans who attended a special preview for Trekkies at 11 a.m. on opening day at the Florida Twin, and then possibly after seeing it once or twice more at one of the several area theaters showing it, Weiss attended the Star Trek party at the Longshot Disco at the Holiday Inn Hialeah. The Longshots ad in the Miami News read, "Calling all Trekkies, celebrate the new movie, party." Among the incentives were live entertainment by clockwork and the opportunity to dance and drink till 5 a.m., as well as great prizes, surprises, and contests. And of course, anyone in costume admitted free. Many fans did appear in costume, and also present was one of the standees of the Enterprise at the odd downward angle, at least until it was returned to its theater at midnight. But again, it must be stated that a Miami disco of the sort which specified in want ads that the staff must be young, attractive, and personable was devoting a night to a new sight unseen G-rated studio film. That just did not happen in the brief history of the rating. But I'm going to leave it here because this picture makes me so happy. This picture is what loving something should be about. I mean, they're just having fun. You know, they got to put on costumes and go to a disco and hang out with their friends and see this iconography from their favorite TV show and now movie. And again, it's like they're enjoying themselves. And there's so much, fandoms are just such snake pits these days. And fandom was a snake pit then too. And I go into a lot of that in here, but every so often, it's just people enjoying themselves. And yeah, this picture makes me so happy. And having been able to do this presentation makes me very happy as well. So thank you very much. And I will stop. No more sharing from me. There we go.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much.